Hi there, this is video one of a two-part series on landmark Supreme Court cases. Important cases that you're going to need to know. So we're going to go in kind of chronological order as these cases proceed. And the first one we're going to talk about is Marbury versus Madison. And this is really one of the very first cases the Supreme Court ever hears. What happens is there's a political fight. President John Adams, who was the second president, is going to be voted out of office. And as a result, his last day as president, he's going to run around and try to appoint as many people in his political party as possible to different jobs. Well, Marbury is one of those people who was supposed to be getting a job. He was supposed to be Justice of the Peace in Washington, D.C. But the paperwork doesn't come in time. And the next day, President Jefferson becomes president, and he tells Marbury, sorry, you're out of luck. No job for you. Marbury is going to sue as a result, and the Supreme Court is going to rule that the Judiciary Act of 1789 is unconstitutional. That was what was the law that was being used to assign all these new jobs. The most important part about this case, though, isn't that. It's not really about poor Marbury not getting a job. It sets up the idea of judicial review, the purpose of the Supreme Court. Basically, judicial review is this idea that the Supreme Court has the power to rule whether or not a federal or a state law is unconstitutional or not. And it really gives this power to the Supreme Court. It wasn't spelled out in the Constitution. With this case, it just kind of goes there. Next up, we have McCulloch versus Maryland, and this is 1819. In this case, what has happened is the federal government has set up a national bank, the Bank of America. And there's a branch in Maryland. And Maryland doesn't think it's fair. They think that the federal government's kind of overstepping their bounds. So as punishment, they want to tax that federal bank. And of course, the federal bank has no way going to start paying taxes to the state of Maryland. So what happens is that it ends up in the Supreme Court. And the court rules that the federal authority outweighs the state. The state does not have the right to tax that bank. And this is because of the supremacy clause in the Constitution. The federal government outweighs the state government. Up next, we have our next case is Gibbons versus Ogden, and this is 1824. What happens in this case is Ogden is given a monopoly. He runs a steamboat in New York State, back and forth across the river, the Hudson River, between New York and New Jersey. And he is the only one to get this permit from the state of New York. Well, Gibbons comes in and wants to do the same thing, but he has a federal permit. But the state of New York doesn't want to let him do it and says, you know, your permit is no good here in the state of New York. So Gibbons is going to sue over this. And it's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's going to rule in the favor of Gibbons. Again, because the federal government has jurisdiction higher than a state government. If there's a matter between more than one state, then we're going to have the federal government get involved and their say is going to go. Next up, we have the Dred Scott versus Sandford case. This is probably one of the most dreadful cases in Supreme Court history. It dates back to 1857, a few years before the Civil War. Dred Scott was a slave in Missouri, and his owner had moved to a free state, what wasn't quite Illinois yet, and then back to Missouri, back to a slave state. Dred Scott is going to sue for his freedom. His claim is that because he had been moved to a free state where slavery had been banned, that he should no longer be a slave in Missouri either. The Supreme Court is going to rule that he doesn't even have the right to sue, that he as a slave is not a citizen. On top of that, though, the Supreme Court is going to shoot down what was called the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise is what made slavery illegal in the North. Basically, it was a compromise in Congress where they drew a line through the middle of the country and said, okay, slavery will be legal in the South and illegal in the North. So the Supreme Court is going to shoot down that compromise and claim it's unconstitutional, saying that slavery should be legal all through the country. Okay, we're going to fast forward a few years past the Civil War and on to a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. This is 1896. So we're past the Civil War, and what we have now are Jim Crow laws coming into place. Slavery's been outlawed, but they're going to try to keep African Americans from utilizing their rights. So Louisiana had passed a law segregating trains. Now Plessy was a light-skinned person who was 1/7, 1/8 African American. Most of his ancestors were white, and he sat in a white-only car but was arrested. They claimed that he was an African American and breaking the law. This is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to rule that segregation is okay, as long as it's separate but equal. That was the phrase that they used. Keep that in mind because it's going to come back. Next up, we have Schneck versus the United States. We fast forward now to World War I. During the war, Schneck is mailing out flyers protesting the draft. A draft is when you're forced to join the military. And he's asking people to peacefully refuse to join the military. He's charged with conspiracy to violate the Espionage Act. What the Supreme Court does is it rules against him. He's actually upheld his conviction. They say his words are not covered by the First Amendment because of the fact we're at war. And the Supreme Court claims that he is endangering the nation by trying to convince people that they should not serve in the military. So this is a time where we see the Supreme Court taking into consideration the needs of the whole nation versus the rights of individuals. This is a second example of something along those same lines. We're going to fast forward to World War II, and this is Korematsu versus the United States. During World War II, FDR, the president, signed an executive order that set Japanese Americans, these are American citizens, to what were known as internment camps. Basically, they're prison camps. The government was worried that they would side with Japan and attack us or act as spies for Japan. Now, these are innocent people. The vast majority of them, they didn't commit a crime or anything. Their only crime was of their heritage. They were, Japanese Americans. Korematsu refuses to leave his home in California and was arrested as a result. So this case is going to go to the Supreme Court to see if this is constitutional or not. The Supreme Court is actually going to rule for the government. They claim that the government's need to defend the nation was greater than the individual rights of Japanese Americans. Okay, up next we have Brown versus the Board of Education. We've talked about this one before, 1954. We have schools segregated across the South under Plessy versus Ferguson. Actually, this is several cases coming together with the NAACP where they're suing on the fact that education for African Americans is not equal. It's separate, but the same amount of money, the same quality of teachers and supplies is not the same. The Supreme Court is going to rule for the NAACP. They rule that segregation of public schools is unconstitutional because things weren't equal. This precedent, though, is going to expand to include most segregation laws, not just education. Okay, up next we have Mapp versus Ohio. This is 1961. And this is a case about evidence. This woman, Mapp, had been convicted of possessing obscene materials, dirty magazines. And they had been found when the police were illegally searching her home looking for a fugitive. But they've come across these outlawed magazines instead, and she's arrested and convicted. When it goes to the Supreme Court rules that the evidence that was found without a warrant is inadmissible because of the exclusionary rule. Next we have Gideon versus Wainwright. This is 1963. And Gideon is a homeless man who's arrested and put on trial for breaking and entering. When he goes in front of the court, he cannot afford a lawyer, and he actually requests one from the state. But the state denies his request, and he's forced to represent himself. Well, needless to say, representing himself, he's going to be convicted. It's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court, And the Supreme Court's going to rule that the government must provide an attorney if someone cannot afford one. Our legal system is way too complicated to expect people to know how to navigate it. Up next, we have Miranda versus Arizona. In this case, again, we have several cases that are being brought together, and they're going to challenge the interrogation methods of the police. Miranda had confessed to rape, but he hadn't been warned that his confession was actually going to be used against him. The Supreme Court ruled that police officers must inform you or warn you of your constitutional rights. So we've talked about these before. You know, your right to remain silent, your right to have an attorney, all those things that you see on an episode of Law and Order. Up next, we have Loving versus Virginia, and this is 1967. In this case, an interracial couple had been married in Washington, D.C., where it was legal, and they had moved to Virginia. Well, in Virginia, it was against the law for people of different races to marry, and the couple were actually arrested and put into jail. They were sentenced to a year in prison. Well, of course, they're going to appeal their conviction. It's going to go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules that the Virginia law broke the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, and that the statute or the law that banned interracial marriages in Virginia was unconstitutional. Okay, up next we have N. Ray Galt. This is 1967. A young man, Gerald Francis Galt, was arrested for making obscene phone calls. At the time, he was only 15 years old and on probation. When the police arrested him, they didn't notify his parents who were at work. And so they weren't there when he's arrested. They weren't there when he was interrogated. None of those things happened with his parents present. And he's actually sentenced to juvie until his 21st birthday. They're going to appeal. And what the Supreme Court says is that they have to inform his parents. And by not doing so, they violated his 14th Amendment rights. His parents and the child had the right to a lawyer the whole time. They had a right to cross-examine his accusers. He was supposed to be given his Miranda rights and told not to self-incriminate. And those things didn't happen in the presence of his parents. Okay, that's it for this time. This is what our second episode will look like.